Hello and welcome. My name is Athena Donald, and as Master of Churchill College, I'm delighted to welcome you to this first discussion in a year-long series of events that aim to open up a meaningful discussion on the subject of Churchill, empire, and race. I'm sure I speak for the whole college community when I say that we were horrified by the death of George Floyd this summer, a truly appalling event, which quite rightly reignited the long smouldering grievances surrounding systemic, if often casual, racism on both sides of the Atlantic. I hope that the statements issued at the time by the university and this college made our support for the aims of the Black Lives Matter protesters very clear. That those protests in London focused on the Churchill statue was naturally a cause of particular concern here at Churchill College. As I wrote at the time, we have an additional responsibility given the name that the college carries. As an educational and research institution, we acknowledge the need for, and indeed welcome, an honest and critical engagement with history in all its fullness. We accept that this will involve some difficult discussions around important historical features, which we will actively seek to facilitate. Churchill, as a successful leader in time of war, must not be mythologized as a man without significant flaws. On race, he was backward even in his day. We aim to lead an ongoing critical dialogue about his own legacy in global history, utilising not only the full depth of our fellowship, staff and student body, but also the rich material contained in the papers of the Churchill Archives Centre. So that was what we said in the summer. And to ensure that we actively engage with this and other equality issues, we've set up an overarching Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which will have oversight of the work of different working groups. And it is in this spirit we've established a working group that brings together all three common rooms in the college and which is in the process of developing a programme of events. Tonight is the first in what will be a series of public talks on aspects of Churchill, empire and race. These events will be supported by a dedicated webpage as well as internal discussions. Our aim is to engage accurately and truthfully with all aspects of our founder and foundation, and by better understanding our past, seek to shape our future better. That is why it's important that this specific initiative is complemented by further work on greater inclusivity within the current college community. I'm glad to see the Pan-African flag flying over Churchill for Black History Month, and I'm excited at plans for an exhibition later in the year on the achievements of our Black alumni. Our first speaker tonight is Professor Priya Gopal. Priya has been leading the fight against racism locally, nationally, and internationally for a long time, sometimes facing horrible and huge amounts of vitriol. She holds a chair in the Faculty of English, and her primary interests are in colonial and post-colonial studies. Her most recent published work is in Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Descent, which has been nominated for the British Academy's Nyafel Roden Prize. She'll be followed by Professor Richard Toye. Richard has written several books on Churchill, but perhaps most relevant for today are Churchill's Empire, The World That Made Him and the World He Made, and his recently co-edited volume on the Churchill myths. He is a professor at the University of Exeter, but has spent many hours labouring in our Churchill Archives Centre and has contributed to former conferences and events here. It's great to welcome him back, albeit virtually. I'm personally grateful to them both for being prepared to help us open a difficult but important conversation. Can I remind you that the Q&A channel will be open throughout? It's at the bottom of your screen. So do submit your questions during the following conversation, and we'll have 15 to 20 minutes at the end for answering them. It would be helpful if you could specify which of the panelists your question is addressed to at the start of the question. And now over to Priya.
Thank you, Athene. My thanks to you and to Alan Packwood, the director of the Churchill Archives, for hosting this conversation. I really welcome this conversation that the college has initiated. It's in some ways long overdue, not just in the college, but nationally. And I hope very much that it can be part of a longer, wider, sustained national one. I do also want to particularly thank the students who over the years have asked critical questions and who have called for us to engage both with Churchill's legacies and with the Black Lives Matter movement. As Dame Athene said, this is a difficult conversation, and it is going to require courage on the part of everyone, all parties who engage in it, but it is also a necessary conversation, not least for an educational institution like Churchill College, which has a dual role. On the one hand, it is a commemorative national monument, and as such, it has to perforce participate in some of the national mythologies and stories and narratives around Sir Winston, as well as, of course, Britain itself. On the other hand, the college has an educational duty to research and teaching, and that perhaps calls for a more difficult engagement with honesty, with thinking about what goes on under the mythologies. Richard and I will be talking about this shortly. And so I think that today's conversation brings together both aspects of the college's mission. One is the kind of commemorative aspect and its engagement with national mythologies, and the other is the historical realities of both Churchill and his times. Churchill, it is fair to say, has a position that no British politician, no other British politician of his time or before really holds. I think it is fair to say that there is a huge cult around Churchill, and in many ways it is a personality cult, but it is also hugely iconic of how Britain wishes to think about itself. We're going to go back, as I said, to the question of mythology, but I want to show you the image that gives us the background to this conversation, and that really kind of kicks off how we got here. So yes, you should be able to see that on my screen. This is, of course, the statue of Churchill in Parliament Square, which was the subject of graffiti. And you can see here Churchill's name scratched out and was a racist underneath. Now, whatever our views on that graffito, it does remind us that there are a great many people, of course, who will hear no ill of Churchill, but there are also a great many, not just outside Britain, but also within Britain, who feel anything from criticism to deep revulsion at the figure of Churchill. The aversion is writ large in this graffiti here. And I think that whatever our views on that, we are obliged to ask why. And I think we are particularly required to ask this question about why so much of the world views Churchill in some ways as monstrous, as very, very problematic. And we must ask what it means today for us in Britain, because we live in a society of the sort that Churchill would not have been happy about, a multicultural society that he referred to as a magpie society. We do live in a magpie society, for better or for worse. Here we are, and I think we need to think about how our interpretation of Churchill matters today. Now, before raising the knotty question of who is or is not a racist, I think we should take a minute to provide ourselves with a working definition of racism. Churchill was certainly an imperialist. He would be the last person to deny that. And one of the questions I think we have to ask is whether it is possible to be an imperialist without being a racist, to the extent that the project of empire and the project of white supremacy and racism were very, very intimately tied up. I don't think there is any serious historian who would deny that. Now, rather than think in terms of racism being an offensive term from which one must flinch, or rather than think simply of a racist as a bad person, I think it is more helpful to think about racism thus. We call it racism today. It would probably have been called racialism in Churchill's time. Racism, I think, is the claim or the belief that there is a biological basis on which human beings can be categorized and separated. That is, that category being race. And that therefore there are fundamental differences between them. Usually, not always, but usually in a hierarchy. In Churchill's time, that would have been white supremacy with whiteness at the top of a very complicated hierarchy of race. I'm just going to move my screen down a little bit so you can see a couple of other quotations. I may not read out all the quotations, but I just want them to be there. White supremacy is the very real hierarchy in which I think the world is ordered to this day still. And certainly within Britain, white supremacy has not gone away, nor, of course, as we know well, in the United States. I don't think, again, that it is hugely controversial to suggest that Churchill was invested in white supremacy. You can see from the two quotations I've put up here, one where he talks about the native peoples of America and Australia, and actually talks about why settler colonialism was okay, because a higher grade, a better race had come in and taken that place. And then the next quotation is from Henry Wallace, the Vice President of the United States under Roosevelt, who argued with Churchill about Churchill's notion of Anglo-Saxon superiority. And he quotes Churchill in his diary as saying, why be apologetic about Anglo-Saxon superiority? We were superior, we had a common heritage, and this is what brings America and the USA together. So today, when we talk about the special relationship, I think we should be quite clear-eyed about the fact that it does contain a degree of the idea of white supremacy and Anglo-Saxon supremacy specifically underlying it. This had particular consequences for the way in which Churchill thought about the empire, because one of Churchill's deeply held beliefs was that not all races had the right to be free. And this is why he, in a sense, fell out with the Americans over the Atlantic Charter, which proclaimed the right to self-determination and freedom. And Churchill struck a dissenting note when he came out and said the Atlantic Charter did not apply to Britain's colonies. And so therefore, I think the whole question of freedom and British freedom is more complex than we think it might be, because it was never meant really for the black and brown and other peoples of the world to embrace. Now, a standard argument when these facts are brought up is that Churchill, it is anachronistic to talk about Churchill in these ways, that he was an Edwardian, he was a man of his time. But I think that we can say two things. One, not all Edwardians and Victorians thought about the empire and race in exactly the same way. Churchill was quite famously behind the curve on race and imperialism, even in his time. But we also should note that he said much of what he did and said in an era when anti-colonialism was sweeping the world. So equally, it is valid to describe him as an imperialist in anti-imperialist times. And the point about the Atlantic Charter is relevant here. One of the most striking aspects of thinking about Churchill or reading about Churchill is how little critical material there is. And the other thing that is interesting is that whenever controversies are brought up in the public sphere, there are things that Churchill said that people can't turn away from, including his interest in eugenics and his very, very problematic assertions on the Indian famine and on deaths in India, as well as in Africa. I think that there's a tendency to explain these things away and to say, well, either there's a context or to suggest that actually he might have said this, but he was also benevolent. He also cared about Africans and Indians. And I want to say here that we do need to make a distinction between race and racialism and paternalism. It's perfectly possible for people to hold very deeply racist views, but also be paternalist and benevolent. In fact, I think Churchill's understanding of Asian and African peoples were that they were like little children, who had to be brought up and brought and looked after by Britain. I'm going to leave you here before I hand over to Richard with a couple of quotations that I think it is worth keeping in mind. One is a quotation that people don't know is not that familiar, which is him giving a send-off to Viceroy Wavell in India in 1943. And you can see that here he is talking about the fact that far from the famine having damaged Indians, under British rule, Indians have simply increased in number. And he says that's not a very good thing. We know Churchill had a lifelong interest in eugenics, both in Britain, in relation to people who were described as unfit or feeble, but also in relation to Indians and Africans. He on many occasions would say that the deaths of Indians and Africans wasn't a big problem because there were so many of them anyway. He spoke about Indians breeding like rabbits. And even his contemporaries recognized what I think can be reasonably safely described as an obsession with race and skin color. Lord Moran, his private physician, is on record saying, Winston thinks only of the color of their skin. Then you have Leo Amery, himself a conservative, himself a Tory, a politician, Secretary of State for India, himself not at all immune to racism, but he has a correspondence with the Viceroy and with Churchill during the famine, trying to get Britain to do something about the terrible condition in India. And he notes, on the subject of India, Winston is not quite sane. I didn't see much difference between his outlook and Hitler's. It's quite common nowadays for people who are critical of Churchill to make that comparison, and it sounds perhaps a bit unhinged, but actually you've got one of his own contemporaries saying that in terms of thinking about other races, Churchill has a very long way to go. The final quotation, I just want to put it here because I want to come back during discussion to the familiar opposition of colonialism and fascism, and colonialism being a relatively good thing, and fascism being, really the war against fascism gives Churchill his moral credo. But you can see that Churchill, while he was virulently against Hitler, did not always think about authoritarianism or fascism as bad things. To Mussolini, he says, fascism has rendered a service to the entire world. If I were Italian, I am sure I would have been with you entirely, albeit he's saying this in 1927. So these are just preliminary remarks towards outlining the terrain that we are on. And I hope we can grapple with some of these difficult questions in discussion. Over to Richard Toye now.
Thank you very much. I will also share my screen so that you can see just a few slides I made. We shall start with quotation from Piers Morgan on Good Morning Britain last year, and Piers Morgan frequently has these set twos about Churchill with guests, this time with Professor Kahinda Andrews of Birmingham City University, who had commented on Churchill's racism, and Piers Morgan said, "I am not going to be told to feel ashamed of my country just because you say we're a bunch of racists." Now, Dame Athene and Priya have both alluded to sort of the need for difficult conversations, and I suppose it's interesting to consider why these conversations are difficult and why it can be hard to get it from to get this of Churchill's historical record and its significance. And I think that this illustrates the point, because Professor Andrews hadn't called Piers Morgan a racist, and you haven't told him to feel ashamed of his country. However, it was very clear that when you make certain factual statements about the things which Churchill said and did, then one very quickly interpreted as saying certain things. So see how Piers Morgan moves from the fact that being criticised to that he and his country, and that in Britain is being accused of being racist. And I think this Churchill to symbolise the nation, and therefore draw attention first of all to and utterly condemning Churchill, and then by extension one is believed to be condemning the entire British nation, not merely at the time when Churchill was alive but in the present day, and to be personally calling people who live in Britain now racist. So that if this sort of relatively sort of simple and factual statements about Churchill are interpreted in this way, it's not surprising that conversation quickly becomes very rancorous. So I think it's maybe worth me emphasizing that I'm not asking anybody to feel ashamed of anything. And I'm not asking them to dislike Churchill, and I'm not calling anyone personally a racist, and I won't do it unless I see there is direct evidence that they are. But so I think that we can sort of, if we put the difficult bit to one side for a moment and simply return to a few of Churchill's statements. Well, Priya has gone over this ground a little, so I needn't take a long time. But let's just sort of get some of those statements out there, so that so that we know what we're discussing. So, we move on to we establish what he said first, and we move on to the significance of what he said later on. And nobody really disputes any of these quotations. Nobody disputes the fact that he said these things. 1942, I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. 1943, we've already had the quote from Henry Wallace's diary. He said, "Why be apologetic about Anglo-Saxon superiority, that we were superior." 1954, writing to Dwight Eisenhower, so not being reported by anybody else. These are his own direct words that he wrote himself. A bit skeptical about universal suffrage for the Hottentots, even if refined by proportional representation. 1954 again, I hate people with slit eyes and pigtails. 1954 once more, say that he did not really think that black people were as capable or as efficient as white people. And you may think, well, was he having a particularly bad year in 1954? Well, the reason that I've sort of included these ones is because sometimes people say, well, over time, Churchill mellowed, and sort of by his old age, he'd sort of come to realize that his former views weren't quite right, which I don't think is true. So if anybody wishes to argue that these aren't racist statements, then I'll happily debate any of them, but I think they are all quite explicitly racist. So then we move from establishing what he said to what we might consider the significance to be. Again, Priya has gone over a little of this ground already, but sort of arguments you may hear, and I sort of see some of this already reflected in at least one question in the chat so far. And so these are arguments you may hear from people who sort of feel affronted that Churchill has been criticised. And I could also, if I had more time, go on to say something about sort of the arguments that you may hear from those people who sort of call Churchill monstrous, which also fall into relatively set patterns. However, first of all, he was a man of his time. Well, Priya has addressed this already. And we'll sort of put these down here. So as Priya has said, other people, including conservative imperialists of a similar age and background, also criticised him for the racist views that he expressed. As well as saying that he was a man of his time, people also say very much in the same breath, well, he said lots of progressive sounding things too, so he was actually ahead of his time, so we should laud him for how enlightened he was. Well, he did indeed say things which could be cast in that light. He did condemn, for example, in the Edwardian period, sort of brutal British punitive raids in West Africa. But in a sense, what we need to do is we need to understand both the progressive sounding things that he said and the racist ones, and we need to put them together and understand his views in totality and in their specific context. People also say, it seems to me a rather remarkable thing to say, but he can't have been a racist because he condemned the Holocaust. Well, of course he did, in eloquent terms. But I would say that sets a very high bar for defining racism, that, if you're against genocide, then you can't be racist. It seems, I don't think that's really a sensible definition of looking at things. And so people then say, well, his many achievements outweigh his regrettable comments on race. Well, that may be, that's an interesting point for debate, but that doesn't mean that we therefore don't need to talk about his racial views and discuss their significance. And finally, we should distinguish between what he said and what he did. And that's certainly true, we do, but that cuts both ways, because Churchill sometimes paid lip service to high ideals, which is where you find the sort of the progressive sounding quotations, but failed to follow through in practice. So distinguishing between what he said and what he did doesn't always come out in Churchill's favor. And so what I really feel is that because the fact that Churchill said these things is kind of undeniable, people sort of move to sort of dismiss them or marginalize them or say they weren't important. I will be very quick on my final slide. The main purpose of history, in my view, is not to reach judgments on the moral worth of individuals, and that's certainly not what I'm really trying to do in my work on Churchill. The key question for me is, what was the societal significance of Churchill's racial views at any given point, whether that was in 1906 or 1938 or 1943 or whenever. Clearly, racism is a spectrum of beliefs, and that's not to say that weaker forms of racism are somehow acceptable or okay, but we do need to at least discuss where on that spectrum, with Hitler at one end and at the other end the least racist person in the world, as they're calling him, Donald Trump, at the other. So where on this spectrum of sort of between genocide and total non-racism does Churchill fall is an interesting point for discussion. And so it's tempting, and people often do this in journalistic articles, of course, but we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't engage in battles of quotations, but rather we should try to understand how Churchill's entire worldview functioned. And the reason that we need to do this from the historian's point of view is to understand, we need to understand Churchill's views on race in order to understand a wide range of other issues, such as his attitude to the USSR and to European unity. And I could say more about that later on. Most people agree that Churchill's explicit racist comments are problematic, but his beliefs about Anglo-Saxon superiority were also embedded in themes such as civilization and the English-speaking peoples. In other words, it's tempting to sort of almost everybody can agree that the kinds of quotations which I've outlined were problematic in some way, even if people dismiss their significance. But actually, we need to look at other aspects of his thought as well, if we're to fully understand both his views on race and his worldview as a whole.
So thanks for that. That was really very interesting. Richard, I have loads of questions for you, but I'm not going to throw them all at you. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, and it relates to your point about the societal significance of Churchill rather than, the man, or what he might have said or not said. A relatively recent article, I think for the Times, but there was another one on CNN. In both of them, you have spoken about the need to not do the reverse of a personality cult around Churchill, the kind of great man history, and focus on him as kind of uniquely terrible and evil. I was going to ask you to say a little bit more about that, but one thing I wanted to say was, well, I take your point, but given the extent to which Churchill is iconic, given the extent to which that great man history permeates British, the cultural and political sphere, is there a way around it? Is there a way not to actually focus on Churchill's deeds and words, precisely because that is already the terrain on which we function?
Well, all right, let me answer the first question first. So, you used this word earlier on that some people regard him as monstrous. People literally describe him as a monster. And I find that, sort of equally problematic as people who claim that was sort of sent by God to save the British and sort of could do no wrong. And I think that it sort of fulfills a very kind of natural human desire for heroes and villains. But I don't really think that that's how history works. There's obviously a strong temptation for people to sort of think, well, bad things happening in history are the consequences of bad people deciding to do bad things. But in fact, I mean, that may be one cause, clearly is one cause. But actually, quite often things that go wrong, well-intentioned people or sort of, morally indifferent people who, sort of do things which they think are unproblematic, which end up leading to terrible consequences. And so I think that something that people's solution to what they think is a sort of absurd, sort of heroic myth of Churchill is to react by saying, well, no, that's it's not true. He was a kind of a demon who was actually responsible for sort of all these, for all sort of almost all the bad things in the world can be laid at his feet, which actually ends up sort of reproducing his own view of how history operated, which is a sort of late 19th century, that it is really sort of driven by, sort of great men, even if the great men may be sort of, sort of wicked or evil, that this is how history is driven forward. So that's really kind of what I meant by those comments in those articles.
I think we're agreed that, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say in response to your other question, that I think that, well, how can we get around it? Well, in a sense, my kind of approach, when I wrote this book was to try to do the, sort of widen it out to say that because people make these very easy assertions about, well, sort of everybody in that time thought that way. I thought, well, let's actually try and show how he sits in perspective with the other people who were there at precisely that time. Now, of course, people criticize me saying, well, how can you say we need to, sort of do away with this sort of great white men theory of history when in fact you've written 6 books about Churchill. But of course, what I'm trying to do is to not make it all about his personal character, because I think that ultimately, I think that an explanation which says, well, marvelous things happened because sort of Churchill was a good person. Well, I don't know how far that really takes us in terms of historical explanation. Equally, I don't think saying bad things happened because Churchill was a bad person explains anything very much either. You simply kind of end up going round in circles. Well, why was he good or why was he bad is simply sort of reduced to some kind of accident of character, which I don't think really is sort of any form of historical explanation. And therefore, when one starts to sort of move away from sort of the good versus evil issue, but to see, well, where did his ideas come from? How were his ideas structured? How did they fit together? How influential were his ideas? I mean, I think there's a justification for studying him, of course, is that his words were read and heard by millions of people, and indeed may have shaped their views. And also, of course, he was particularly eloquent, so that and he wrote and said an awful lot and therefore that so when you're looking for change over time, over a very long period, he had such a wonderfully long political career, that it becomes an excellent sort of starting point for investigation. And so I think that how should we proceed? I think that it really is trying to see how with these sort of famous individuals, how they fit into their societal context, which could be done with other figures to a great extent as well.
Yeah, but my point is that he is outsized. He is outsized in a way that no other British or other politician I can think of is outsized. I wasn't suggesting that describing him as a monster is the answer. That wasn't my question at all.
No,
my question was
I know.
Given how consequential, not just his personality, I think we can set aside the personality and person, but as you say, he was part of an ideological force. He was part of an ideology, and that ideology was deeply consequential, particularly for people across the colonies. I mean, it did have life and death consequences. As a literary critic, for me, the words are perhaps quite important. One of the problems with the Bengal famine was the refusal to declare it a famine till quite late in the day. So words used or not used are consequential. And given that this is a person around whose words so much has hung and around whose ideologies and therefore the actions have happened, it seems to me it's a difficult question how we think about Churchill and Churchillian ideologies, I guess, which are also not in the past. They are very much with us today in different ways.
Well, I mean, I can only completely agree with everything that you say. And I think that, what's interesting, what I was sort of trying to get at the end of my talk was that people who, sort of see certain aspects of Churchill's ideology as unproblematic. It's like, well, we can sort of parcel off certain bits and say, well, yeah, all right, that was a bit unfortunate, but there's sort of all this other stuff, and we can really ignore it. They actually end up quite unconsciously, in many cases at any rate, sort of reproducing what was effectively white supremacist ideology, and which, if you tell them it's white supremacist ideology, they really have great difficulty believing it.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the consequences, the historical consequences of some of the ideological investments that Churchill and others in his milieu participated in terms of what happens in the colonies and beyond.
Well, I mean, there's sort of almost where to begin, I think, but I suppose what it boils down to is sort of persistent downgrading of the importance of the lives of sort of black and brown people. It actually isn't normally thought to be the case that they're of absolutely no account whatsoever. Sort of overtly murdering them is not thought to be a sort of an all right thing to do. However, when their interests collide with those of white people, then it is the interests of white people that will be prioritized. So one sort of consistently sees this in Kenya with the issue of the so-called white highlands, which are sort of an area supposed to be thought particularly good for farming, which is sort of ends up being sort of reserved for white people and so on. And then of course sort of this general attitude of sort of dispensability, if you like, is obviously seen with the camps in Kenya during the Mau Mau period as well. And you certainly do see mass executions, or at least executions of very large numbers of people sort of approximately the same time. And so these are one can say as well with of course with the period of sort of the unrest in India after World War I, one thing which Churchill does, which is always sort of raised by his defenders, is to point out, quite rightly, that he's condemned the Amritsar massacre. Now, he was slightly dragged into that. He was the government was in a political fix, and they kind of brought out one of the big guns, and that for complex reasons, condemning the Amritsar massacre was an important thing for him to do, and he did it in a very skillful way. But he did it in such a way as to suggest that this was kind of a totally unique thing, which sort of never happened, and was again, this was a sort of a something which had gone kind of very badly wrong, but this isn't the kind of, this is not what we do in the British Empire. Well, of course, as sort of Indian newspapers pointed out at the time, it was exactly the sort of thing that was going on all over the place, albeit with not necessarily with hundreds of people being killed at exactly the same time. And really, Dyer got into difficulty because he actually, instead of kind of making a series of excuses and saying, "Oh, well, I was terribly confused and didn't know what was going on," and in the anxiety, this is what has happened, in which case probably he would have, it would have been passed over quite quickly. He actually defended what he did, and he sort of explicitly said, well, of course I knew what I was doing, and this was completely necessary. So that was kind of from the political point of view, that was the wrong thing for him to do. And there are all sorts of colonial massacres which have been sort of totally forgotten by history. Because there are only certain ones which become kind of exemplary of of when things go wrong. So sort of violence was really quite normal, it's wrong to see these sort of particularly famous massacres as examples of normally everything went well, and these were just kind of a series of one-offs.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything to the argument that actually Churchill was quite often gung-ho about pretty repressive and violent counterinsurgency techniques in the colonies, for one thing? I mean, what happened in Kenya with Mau Mau is just kind of one example. His writings about Omdurman are quite gleeful about the kind of violence that was inflicted there. But is there something to the argument that some of those, that investment in repressive counterinsurgency came home? That it came home, for instance, to Tony Pandy and what happens with the miners and the repressive attack on, bringing in the army to suppress strike action and so on.
I think over a longer term, that is probably a correct argument, in that I would say, if you look, I mean, not particularly talking about Churchill, but if you sort of look forward to Bloody Sunday in 1972, then yes, I think in the case of Tony Pandy, I think no. I think that is a case where, I mean, of course, at the time the Daily Mail sort of criticised him for not being tough enough, it is worth actually sort of reading all the press reports and seeing what absolute chaos was happening in Toye Pandy at the time, and rather as in sort of originally in the late 60s when the British Army was sent into Northern Ireland, the idea was sort of genuinely to restore order, and contrary to legend, nobody was shot at that time, although it's worth also mentioning that a couple of people were shot when in Toye Pandy in Llanelli the following year, when Churchill was still Home Secretary. But people, it is one of these things where people fixate on particular kind of myths or legends, even when actually they could probably, if they wanted to make the point, they could find another way to make the point equally accurately. But I don't think, I mean, I think it's generally true that, Churchill was very often for sort of a firm hand. And of course, you see that with the repression in Ireland immediately after World War I. But I don't think I would go quite as far to make that explicit link between the colonies and Toye Pandy.
We're probably running out of time, Richard. I wanted to give you a chance to just talk about this book that you co-wrote with Stephen Fielding and Bill Schwartz, where you don't talk about Churchill the man or the politician, but you talk about the mythological uses of Churchill since Churchill and today.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you might specifically kind of address it in relation to how does the myth of Churchill and the various mythological uses to which Churchill has been put, how does that sit in relation to Black Lives Matter and the kinds of questions that are now on the table around white supremacy and Britishness and racial justice?
Gosh, well, that's an awfully big question. I suppose I think that it's, you know, what has happened in the year since his death is that actually, although there's kind of a core resonant image of Churchill that has stayed relatively constant, there are actually all sorts of things that have changed. So that up until you know, certainly during his lifetime within Britain, I don't think he was ever criticised over the Bengal famine. I don't think he was much criticised over it even after key documents had been released in the 70s and 80s, you know, sort of even to the 1990s, but perhaps in the last 20 years, he has been extensively criticised over it, and it's become a kind of a key point of reference in the debate. So I would say that the, you know, sort of the terrain keeps changing, the terrain keeps moving. What does it mean for the Black Lives Matter thing? Well, I mean, I suppose that, you know, I don't think that although Churchill was much criticised in the 60s and 70s, I don't think sort of the Black Power activists in the 70s were particularly concerned or worked up about Churchill. And I think that in a way, you know, why do people focus on him now? Well, in a sense, I think they know that this is something that will get attention, actually, so that there are a number of statues that were defaced. I think that one of Smuts was defaced at the same time as the one of Churchill. I sort of saw a press report on that, went back and tried to find it and couldn't find it. But essentially, you know, defacing Smuts, who was, you know, equally racist, possibly a bit more racist, isn't going to attract serious headlines in the Daily Mail or, you know, articles in the Guardian or wherever. It won't spread on social media because most people don't really know who Smuts was. And so in a sense, that's your point about him being so talked about, is that it's kind of, you know, leads him to become more talked about, because he becomes a kind of a lightning rod for contemporary debates, and, you know, sort of, you know, understandably enough, the sort of people want to have arguments about the past and the British Empire. And if you want to start an argument, he's a very effective person to choose as a basis for that argument, whichever side of the debate you're on.
But of course, I mean, he is constantly being mythologized in film and television. So it's not as though Black Lives Matter came along and decided to resurrect Churchill. They have they're dealing with a very, very live and vibrant you know, set of myths.
It kind of, put it this way, sort of the more that Boris Johnson talks about Churchill, the more that it is going to provoke people to sort of react against that. And in fact, you know, the effect of Boris Johnson talking about Churchill, you know, Boris Johnson may think that's going to make people like Boris Johnson, but actually the effect may be to make people dislike Churchill. You know, so I think that you know, sort of that I would say that these, you know, these divisions about Churchill have, of course, been present in one form or another sort of during his entire lifetime, and they're not something that occurred new from 1965. And so the debates that we're having now, they have evolved, but they do, you know, have their roots in arguments that were taking place while he was still alive.
Okay, I think we've probably got to hand over to Alan Packwood now. Thanks a lot, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Priya, and thank you to both of you. Won't surprise you to know that we've had a lot of questions coming in. I'm not going to have time to get through all of them, so I'm going to pick out some that I think build on what you've been discussing. And we'll start with one from Churchill Fellow Bobby Reddy, and he asks, and I think this is to both of you, discussions about Churchill and race generally seem to have been hijacked in recent years by mainstream political ideology, with criticism and glorification being associated with the left and right, respectively. How do we decouple discussions on race from politics and back into ethics and morality? Do you want to start with that one, Priya?
Yeah, I don't think you can. Race is profoundly political. I don't think that in this particular context, it is possible to do that or even desirable to do that. Certainly as a literary theorist, I would not see the division of the ethical and the political as especially either tenable or practicable. Race makes itself very deeply felt through politics. There's an election in the US next week, and there is no way to decouple race from that. There is no way to decouple discussions of school teaching with the parliament talking about, conservative politicians talking about banning what they call, quite wrongly, critical race theory and saying you can't discuss white privilege in schools. That's very political. So I'm not entirely sure that it's possible to separate politics from ethics. Race has always been a deeply political issue in the broad sense of the political, not just party political.
Well, I agree with all that. I suppose I would just move, rather than just echo what Priya has said, I think I would just move the conversation on slightly to say kind of what I would like to see happen, though it's a kind of a pipe dream, would be to for people to be able to think about history in such a way as they didn't regard it as a zero-sum game, because I think that is the problem, that people often react as that if you say, well, black people, here's a series of black people who made great contributions to British history, in some way that is an attempt to take credit away from white people, which strikes me as an extraordinary way of looking at it. But this is actually something which is sort of quite reflected in, I think, it's not something that's peculiar to Britain, around the world, that to say something nice about the Hungarians is to sort of score off the Germans in some way. And so I would just like to have more conversations where this sort of strong kind of often nationalist reaction isn't present, but how you get to that point is really terribly difficult.
Okay, and we have a question then from Annie King. She asks, wouldn't it be more helpful to talk about racist remarks when talking to people rather than calling them racists in order to engage in dialogue? Priya?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think calling people racist is really the way things happen. Obviously, racism is manifested in multiple ways. At the same time, it's part of structure, it's part of culture, it's part of the economic workings of society, it is part of politics, it is part of institutions. So I think focusing on racist remarks can be one part of the discussion, but it's not just that. Racism is much more complicated. And the other thing is that I have found that whether you describe someone as racist or whether you describe a remark as racist, the reaction is still incendiary, an absolute refusal to engage with racism as a problem. It's been discussed in terms of a phenomenon that Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility, where you can't use the R word in institutions. You can't say racism, whether you're talking about remarks or structures, without meeting ferocious pushback and denial.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, to save time, maybe we should just move on to the next question.
Next question from Paul Crofts. Isn't the problem of Churchill less a historical one than the way his legacy affects the views of people today, and his icon status is used to bolster and reinforce racism and a widespread sense of British superiority?
That's for you, Richard.
Well, yes, I agree with that problem, but I mean, of course, as a historian, I'm interested in the historical bit. So in a way, I think that we kind of need to have the conversations about, sort of the myths and the sort of the current interpretations, in order, to be able to have a discussion in a non-emotive way. And so, obviously I'd kind of prefer it if, sort of all the current controversies went away and I could just get on with my, job of, reading interesting historical documents and then offering my analysis of them. But of course, I recognize that I'm all inevitably going to be pulled back into current day controversies. And I suppose to a degree also, I feel some obligation to do so.
Okay. So conflating two further questions that have come in, do we think that Churchill's iconic status, of course, is almost entirely built on his role during the Second World War, rather than what came before and after? And assuming you do both agree, do you think that actually his relevance will diminish naturally with the passage of time as a personal connection with the Second World War passes and it fades out of living memory?
I'll comment on that briefly, and then maybe Richard can say a bit more. I mean,
shall I go first?
I've started, Richard. I'll just finish. I think we've lost him. I hope we get him back.
No, I'm here.
Okay, great. Yes, I mean, obviously his reputation is deeply based in the Allied victory over Nazism, and that has contributed completely to his iconic status. But it is worth remembering that in his day and age, anti-colonialists, both white anti-colonialists in Britain and many campaigners outside Britain, challenged the false distinction that they saw being made between fascist unfreedom and colonial unfreedom. And of course, famously, the Indian National Congress pointed out that it was extraordinary to be asked to participate in a war for freedom when India and many other colonies were not free. And so there's also a kind of little contradiction there where the history of fascism is part of popular culture, but the history of colonialism is part of popular amnesia.
Very quickly, I think it did reach the point where it was starting to die out, but for the reasons that you say, and this was sort of in the late 1990s, but then it was very strongly revived by 9/11 and George W. Bush and events in Iraq. So I think there was a sort of a conscious decision to make use of that mythology at that point for instrumental reasons. And since then, I think, there's been a sort of, if anything, a kind of intensified spiral of discussing Churchill. So I don't think that, I don't think that the current debate is really that much driven by people who still have a living memory of Churchill. I mean, of course, there are people now, in their late 70s who will have some memory of him post-war and so forth. But equally, I think that it is people of sort of the same vintage of Piers Morgan often who are sort of continuing to contribute to these debates, to put it at its most neutral.
Okay, we are at 6:30 now, but I think we've got so many questions and discussion going that for those who are willing to stay, we can perhaps stay on for a few minutes more if that's agreeable to our two speakers.
Sure.
Okay. So the answers you've just given has prompted a question from Jamtan, which is, do you believe this era is post-colonialism? And how long do you think the aftermath of colonialism will remain for?
I assume that's, is that me or both?
I think probably you, Priya, to start with.
I think I don't talk in terms of colonialism as being completely in the past. I prefer to use the word afterlife. There are many situations in the world which are deeply still connected to the history of empire. I mean, let's remember that decolonization, first of all, is not complete. And even some of the colonies which are independent now were independent as late as the 1980s. But also colonialism left behind an apparatus which post-colonial states use. So when I look at my own country, India, I can see the ways, not just not just what the British rule did to India, but also the ways in which India's current rulers are making full use of both colonial legislation and the colonial state apparatus. So sadly, colonialism and its aftermath is with us for the foreseeable future. And I'm not just blaming Britain here. I'm saying that there's been a failure to decolonize in many parts of the world. And this means that the legacy of problems left behind from, whether Palestine or Kashmir, to just give two examples, or enormous poverty in the Caribbean and in Africa, these are all deeply connected to what I just described as the afterlife of empire. So no, we are not in a post-colonial age, and I'm not sure when we will be.
Okay, Richard, do you want to come in on this?
I agree. Let's move on to the next question if there are more questions.
Yeah, there certainly are. So this is coming from Fenja, who asks, what does this mythologization say about material questions of memorialization? Who decides on the nature of Churchill's memorialization? On which things emphasis is placed? To me, the current nature of his memorialization comes across as a continuation of imperialism and white supremacy. And there is a follow-up from that to you, Richard, also from Fenja. Please discuss what you mean by weaker forms of racism. Isn't this all part of a wider issue? Is this gradation not somewhat damaging, allowing figures such as Churchill to be treated unproblematically?
Well, as I said, I don't want to treat it as unproblematically. And, I can, maybe, I mean, there are basically people who advocate genocide explicitly and carry it out. And then there are people who, kind of make unthinking racist remarks. And, the unthinking racist remarks are problematic, and in certain societies and times they may be the kind of the things which help support the genocide. But that is what I mean. Even if weaker is not the word, it is a sort of a different form of racism than explicit racist violence. So as I've said, I don't think. There are some people who say sort of that any attempt to put Churchill or anybody else, sort of in context to sort of explain the environment in which they were operating and sort of where their ideas came from. Some people see that as deeply problematic and sort of regard that as an attempt to sort of whitewash the history. Now, I do think it's perfectly, I can see why people think that, because it's perfectly true that there are some historians and there are some journalists who do it in exactly that way. That's not what I'm trying to do. I sort of tried to explain sort of roughly what I'm trying to achieve. So I take the point seriously, but I think that if one simply says that any form of racism, however sort of however non-violent, however sort of relatively small, compared to the Holocaust, for example, is just as bad as sort of violent extermination. Well, I just think that we end up in a position where it becomes very difficult to have these discussions, because then if you do say that somebody has made a racist remark, then you're effectively accusing them as being somebody who would be willing to carry out genocide. So I absolutely see where you're coming from.
I'm not sure that that's what's being suggested. I think that what's being suggested is that there is a structure of and a network where things feed into each other. I don't think it's being said that, well, someone who makes a racist remark is genocidal, but that really the structures of white supremacy operate at different levels, and they can't really be separated in any sort of easy way.
Well, I agree they can't be separated in any easy way. I completely accept what you're saying. But I think that the fact they can't be easily separated, and that we can't say there are some bits of it that are unproblematic, doesn't mean that we can't try and see how those structures do fit together. So that's what I'm really trying to do, I would say.
There is also the question about who puts the mythologies and myths around Churchill in place, and I do think that this is a really good question, because it's not as though the myth-making factory is happening at all levels of society. It is political. It is largely coming from the British and the United States establishments at whichever political level or side of the political spectrum people fall on. And a lot of the mythology does, in a sense, enforce a present-day status quo, whether in relation to race or whether in relation to class. So I do think the question of who puts these myths in place and endorses them and consolidates them is a good one. I don't know what your thoughts are, Richard.
Well, I certainly think it's a good question. And then, one gets into probably quite a long answer about the sort of the ecosystem, if you like, of where different aspects of memorialization come from. I mean, a lot of it is private enterprise. It's not necessarily state-sponsored, at least in all cases. Of course, the college itself was funded by the valiant efforts, really, of Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, using his contacts in the city to get money. And to carry out, which I think we should emphasize, is not merely memorialization in that particular case, but it is about the preservation of the documents and the sort of the making them available to the public, which is a genuine and important service, which I think we should record that Alan and his team do absolutely brilliantly. So I think that there are statues are perhaps some of the most problematic aspects of these things. I think there are perhaps problematic ways in which sort of the cabinet war rooms have kind of been relabeled the Churchill war rooms, for example. But I mean, of course, you've got to remember that there's the things which we would certainly always want to have preserved. We would want the cabinet war rooms to be preserved so that people can go and look around them. We might well want to rewrite some of the exhibition labels. But I think there's there's a lot of there is the stuff which takes place at the level of formal memorialization, but then there's a lot of stuff which simply takes place in speeches and interviews and so on as well. So and some of it is driven by politicians, some of it is driven by people who have a sort of amateur enthusiasts for Churchill, and the National Trust is obviously in there as well, and so that story of how all these things fit together is a very complex one.
What would you say to those people who are saying that this panel is inherently imbalanced, and that this is a panel of essentially anti-Churchillian panelists?
What have I said that is anti-Churchill? Report to me what I said that was anti-Churchill.
I would say that if we're going to talk about balance, the amount of Churchill hagiography and uncritical takes on Churchill outweigh any criticism by several thousand tons. So in order to even reach anything like balance, we would have to have a panel like this every single day for 2 hours for the remainder of the century. And then we might achieve something like balance. You're right, there is no balance.
I mean, what I think is that if you basically anything which doesn't fit with certain established tropes of Churchill is what is regarded as problematic and as critical. And always take the opportunity to advertise another of my books. The book which has brought me the most criticism is this one about Churchill's World War II speeches. Now, I didn't criticize Churchill's speeches. What I did was I drew attention to the criticism that they received from many people at the time, which is obviously a totally different question. I wouldn't really, although Churchill made some mistakes, on the very broadest level, he did an extremely good job of making speeches during wartime. I didn't criticize the speeches. However, simply to challenge the myth that they were unanimously, enthusiastically received was so disruptive of sort of the established view that it was sort of seen as sort of hugely problematic, and blew up into a whole media controversy and so forth. Whereas my argument would actually be that if you consider the volume of criticism that Churchill had at the time, that shows how difficult his job actually was, and that if everybody had received his speeches with sort of total enthusiasm all the time, then that would have made his job an awful lot easier. So really, the fact that he received this criticism is in some respects to his credit, or at least shows what a particularly difficult situation he was struggling with. But the problem here was not that I had sort of criticized Churchill, but I had disturbed the established view of Churchill, which is something quite different.
Which is, I think, also being equated to being anti-Churchill. I mean, it is extraordinary. This event is taking place under the aegis of the National Memorial. There is no other politician who has a college named after him, a 20th century politician. We are sitting in a sense, under that college's umbrella, raising a few historical points, but even that very minimal and first time effort is being described as unbalanced and anti-Churchill. So I think we have to revisit what balance even means if this is exactly how difficult it is to raise actual balance.
Well, clearly we could go on. We can't give you sort of 2 hours every night for 100 years, but the discussion could certainly continue for another 2 hours tonight, and there will be more discussion. I thought we could just end it with one question to you, Priya, which has come in from Layla Billing, and it was actually the very first question of the evening, but I thought I would come back to it at the end. The question is, can I ask Dr. Gopal whether she thinks equality, diversity, and inclusion is a useful framing or entry point for carrying out intersectional anti-racism work within institutions like Churchill College? Angela Davis famously referred to diversity work as the difference that makes no difference, the change that brings no change. What do you think?
Well, the short version is I agree with Angela Davis in the sense that diversity work can become extremely tokenist and extremely containing of anti-racist energies. That said, I also am cognizant that for the bulk of the time that I've taught here, it has been an extremely racially homogeneous place. And the entry of more Black students and to some extent more Asian students has made a difference to the kinds of discussions that we are having. We wouldn't be having this discussion if there weren't Black students at Cambridge and at Churchill asking us to discuss these questions. So I'm not willing to dismiss diversity wholesale. That said, I agree that diversity must be an opening point for discussions of racial justice and for discussions of something that's very, very different, and that is decolonization and structural change. So I would say, yes, diversity is not enough, but I wouldn't exactly turn my face against it either.
I just, a very final point, which is a practical one, which is that I think, if possible, it would be good if the questions could be sort of cut and paste and saved for the historical record, even though we've not been able to answer all of them.
Yes, he's saving it. Chris is saving it. I already asked him.
Yeah, I believe everything is being recorded and saved, and it will be very interesting to share those with you and to pick up on some of the questions that we haven't had time to answer this evening. I think we've overrun our allotted slot now by over 15 minutes, so I had better reluctantly bring things to a close. I want to end by thanking both Priya and Richard for giving such full, frank, thoughtful and insightful presentations. As they pointed out, this is not an easy subject to talk about. Not easy in the sense, of course, that it can attract a lot of vitriol and abuse. But if we are going to engage with the past, then we need to do it fully and frankly and not shy away from difficult conversations. And this was, just as billed, an opening conversation in a series that Churchill College is committed to running throughout the rest of this year and possibly beyond. So the dialogue will continue, and I want to thank the audience and express the hope that you'll be able to join us in at similar occasions in the future. So my thanks to everybody, and with that, good evening. Thank you.